Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Red Cedar Wild Ones virtual presentation. I'm thrilled that you're joining us on this beautiful Michigan day. However, it's not going to last as it is still March. And I think there's snow in the forecast on Saturday. But it is absolutely beautiful day to learn about spring ephemerals. But first, I'd like to have one monumental announcement. This month marks the Wild Ones Red Cedar chapter's 20th anniversary. Back in 2002, we had 16 members, and today we have over 90. Thanks to all of you who have supported the chapter by taking a leadership position, helping with plant sales, staffing home and garden show booths, weeding rain gardens, and so much more. Let's continue to spread the word about the benefits of native plants well into the future. As a reminder, we will have a booth at the Lansing Home and Garden Show this weekend. If you can't make the show, but want to see some of the literature we have available, go to our website, wildoneslansing.org, and click on informational brochures. Now, on to our speaker. Cheryl M. English is an advanced master gardener living in Detroit, Michigan. Formerly educated as an art historian, Cheryl has parlayed her varied training and experience into a career as a professional gardener, artist, writer, and garden and art educator. She has volunteered in various capacities with the Greening of Detroit, Master Gardeners of Greater Detroit, the Detroit Garden Center, and the Wildflower Association of Michigan. Cheryl penned the first article on native plants to appear in Michigan Gardener in May 2012 and wrote for that publication on topics relating to native plants and clematis. Cheryl opens her garden to the public twice a year free of charge. She also offers private group garden tours, a clematis pruning workshop, tree and wildflower walks at local destinations, as well as a variety of pottery workshops and other programs upon request. She can be reached atcenglish@blackcatpottery.com. And Cheryl, please take it away and let's learn about some spring ephemerals.
Thanks, Carolyn. I appreciate the wonderful introduction. And it is a beautiful day out, although I don't get to see a lot of it because my in-home studio is in my basement. So I actually am kind of a troglodyte in my personal life. But I did, I put my kilns out in my garage, so I have to go out there and do stuff. So I get to see glimpses of the day. And it was a beautiful day today. Much appreciated. The weekend was a little challenging. So it's wonderful to be with you. I wish we could be in person. Maybe the next time I get to talk with you, it will be in person. Things seem to be getting better. Fingers crossed, all digits crossed. But I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to talk with you today. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll try to get to all of them at the end of the presentation. It's one of the things I actually like about Zoom is that you can put something in the chat, comments, you can even kind of converse with people if someone has a question and someone else knows the answer before I get to it. That's just fabulous. One thing I'd like to say, if in the course of this presentation if you feel you'd like to be able to hear from me on a periodic basis, I do put out an infrequent internet-based newsletter. So if you find that you'd like to maybe receive the newsletter, no harm, no foul if you decide to unsubscribe. I include information about native plants, a little bit about my cats, the actual supervisory staff for my business, and things about my pottery and the sort of thing. Please send, comment with your first and last name and your email address in the chat, and I'll try to capture that information. I'm hoping to send out a newsletter in the next few weeks, actually soliciting responses for whether people are interested in a wildflower walk this spring, and if so, whether they would like it to be at Baldock or Belle Isle. I have traditionally done wildflower walks through the Detroit Garden Center. The Detroit Garden Center, after I think about 80 years, actually closed its doors last year. I'd like to try to carry on this tradition of wildflower walks in the Detroit area because there's some really amazing stuff in some unexpected areas. that it's kind of neat to be able to share that with folks. So if any of this interests you, excuse me, please comment accordingly. So we're going to talk about spring wildflowers, woodland wildflowers today. I call them living gems. And it does seem like an appropriate day. We know it's spring here because my neighbor was using his leaf blower to clear out his property today. So we know it's definitely spring here in Detroit, at least for today. So let's get started. Let me see if I can get this going. Okay, so we're going to talk, typically when I put together a presentation, I kind of try to deal with the dry stuff and then get onto the pretty stuff at the end. And kind of finish with a bang. So we're going to talk about some definitions first and sort of get some grounded in what we're actually talking about, characteristics and this sort of thing. When we talk about spring ephemerals, we're talking about plants that emerge in the spring, they flower, then they photosynthesize and then go dormant for the rest of the garden season. And they repeat this same process every year. They're often characterized by fleshy roots, bulbs or corms, tubers, etc. Oftentimes, the only evidence of them later in the season is the seed heads, although this even is not necessarily the case. In some instances, some of them completely fade away, and unless you've marked them, it's difficult to find them until the next season. When we talk about our spring ephemerals, most of us in the US, certainly, we think about our traditional garden flowers, things like daffodils, tulips, grape hyacinth, oriental hyacinth, etc. Things like crocus, squill, pushkinia, all of these plants are spring ephemerals. None of them are native to North America, let alone southeastern middle Michigan. Most of them are native to the Mediterranean basin and the Caucasus Mountains. Oftentimes their scientific names will betray their origins. For example, I think there's is it Pushkinia libanatica? Libanatica refers to Lebanon, for example. This environment that they are from is characterized by cool, moist springs followed by hot, dry summers. They don't generally do well in wet conditions. So what they're doing, their ephemerality is based on the fact that they're going to pursue their reproductive cycle during this optimal season, the spring, before the heat of summer sets in. I want to back up for a minute. One thing that's really interesting about these plants to consider is that now, of course, the Netherlands is where a lot of these plants are grown, hybridized, new varieties come up. But these fields of tulips, for example, in the Netherlands, I can't think of a place less like the Caucasus Mountains than the Netherlands. It's quite impressive that they've been able to create this massive industry with plants that would not typically be found in that location because of their the conditions typically found there. So in terms of our spring ephemerals, our native spring ephemerals consist of things like trillium, bloodroot, Virginia bluebells, jack in the pulpit. These are the plants that evolved here. But their ephemerality, although it's the same dynamic, the provoking context is completely different. In this case, it's not the wet and dry seasons that are driving it. It's the access to sunlight. So we're talking about plants that evolved in deciduous woodlands. And so they have very early season sun before the canopy fills in, and then it's followed by dense shade for the rest of the growing season. So no light really to speak of, or very little light, not enough for them to reproduce. So they take advantage of that early season window before the trees have fully leafed out to emerge, flower, bear seed, photosynthesize and store energy for the next season, and then go to sleep again. When I lead wildflower walks on Belle Isle or in Baldock Park, some of the plants there we see are the trout lilies, for example. And there's swaths of them, of the white, the less common white trout lily is endemic to Belle Isle. The more common yellow trout lily is endemic to Baldock Park. These are both areas that have not been developed It's quite interesting at Baldock. It's a very small part of Baldock Park called the Aspen Trail. There are no aspens on the Aspen Trail, by the way. There may have been at one time, possibly, but there are not now. And because of the plant palette that we found there, I was talking with Bill Schneider about the plants we were finding there. It's unlikely that area was ever developed, probably because it's subject to vernal pooling, as is Belle Isle. So we're talking about an area that was luckily small enough that the ribbon farm that it belonged to could go, oh, we're not going to try to plow that or anything. It's just not worth the effort. And this plant palette has been retained, preserved for generations now, it appears. So another characteristic about some of these plants is this structure called an eliasome. And what this is, it's a structure that's attached to the seed, and it consists of highly caloric oils. So this is a very attractive food source for ants. And what they do is they collect the seed, and they take it back to the nest, and they harvest the food, the oil, and then they chuck the seed out into the midden, the trash pile associated with the nest, where they throw everything, all the other waste from the colony, aborted eggs, deceased ants, waste product of all kinds goes into that midden, which of course makes that a particularly rich context for those seeds to then sprout. In my yard, I have some bloodroot under my yew tree behind my garage. And lo and behold, several years ago, I noticed bloodroot popping up probably about 15 feet away in much more sunny conditions under my Joe Pye. I think it's purpurea, in my prairie bed, or not really prairie, but near prairie. And clearly those seeds were carried there by a third party. And it's a small colony that's developing there. So this is how the eliasome works. It's a seed dispersal strategy. If we're going to talk about landscape application, consider interplanting these ephemerals with later blooming species to keep the season going. And those later blooming species may not be blooming. Consider ferns. There's some fabulous ferns that work well in a wide range of conditions. I'm now working with about 10 ferns. It's my new sort of niche that I'm trying to develop in terms of learning more about native plants. Mosses have still escaped me. I've gotten some traction with grass, some native grasses, and I'm now educating myself about native ferns, and making some progress with those. I've got about 10 species that I'm working with in my yard that I also use in my pottery. I make these fern pod birdhouses that are pretty cool. Another thing to consider is marking the location of the plants to prevent disturbing them while they are dormant. So, and sometimes this can take some planning. And once you've gotten a bed established and you're not going to be doing anything, it becomes less of an issue. But if you're developing a bed and you've got some plants in there that are ephemeral, you might want to stick just a chopstick just to tell you that there's something there. So that if you are going to be putting in additional plants or doing any revisions or anything, that you know that thing is there, and will be less likely to do something you'll regret, which we've all done. So we're going to talk about some of the plants. I'm using the old name here for Anemonella thalictroides, rue anemone. Thing about in the last 20 years, I'd say, we've been doing a lot of DNA analysis of plants and learning that certain things are related in ways that we hadn't expected. Maybe we should have. And the rule of thumb is when we're renaming these plants, when we put them into a new genus, they retain the epithet, and the form of the epithet may change, but the root of the epithet stays the same. We retain that. And what's interesting with this plant is they've now discovered that it's actually a thalictrum. It's a rue, meadow rue. So ironically, the name was formerly Anemonella thalictroides, which means the thalictrum-like. Whenever you see this suffix on an epithet in botanical Latin, it means like. So the thalictrum-like Anemonella. Well, now it's been changed to Thalictrum thalictroides. So it's now the Thalictrum-like Thalictrum, which I find mildly amusing. It's a diminutive plant, and I struggled for a while finding the right place for it. And I've moved things around a lot in my yard and this has been my education of, this is doing well here. Okay, I'm not going to mess with that. Not doing so well here, but did better in this context. Let's try to find this more. And I found a spot where this is doing fabulously. And of course, now I'm planting as much of it as I possibly can in that area because it's happy. It can bloom quite into summer if it's happy. And that's what I'm finding in this one spot finally, is that it's performing beautifully and persisting quite a while. The flowers are usually white. They can be kind of rosy pink. I haven't found any of the plants that I've had that have had that rosy pink quality. But if you look at the foliage, it's very much like, I have 3 other thalictrums in my yard. Purpurescens or purpurea, dioica, and dasycarpum, all of which are much bigger plants, especially not so much dioicum, but purpurea and dasycarpum are really huge plants, 6 feet tall. This guy is, tiny, but plays really well with others and is something that if you tuck it in somewhere, it's a wonderful little surprise to come across. Jack in the Pulpit, one of 2 aroids that I know of native to Michigan, the other being green dragon, which blooms later in the season. Similar structures you have typical of the aroid family. You have the spathe, which is basically a modified leaf. And then the spadix here is where you actually have the sexual parts of the plant. The flowers are actually here. This is a fascinating plant, and I need to do some more research on whether green dragon, I think it's Erythema dracontium, behaves the same way. This is a plant that changes its gender. So if you have a really rather diminutive Jack in the Pulpit plant, it's probably a boy. The idea being that male plants don't need as much energy resources to reproduce because they just donate the pollen. They're the pollen parent. Whereas the female plant has to actually produce the fruit, which requires a great deal of energy. So you might have a very diminutive plant that has a efflorescence, and that might probably be a male plant only producing pollen. And a very large plant may be female, and they can be pretty darn big. Well, the next year, that female plant may not be female anymore because she's expended so much energy reproducing, putting up that fruiting body with all the wonderful red berries. And she may have reverted to a masculine gender until she's able to rebuild her resources in the root system to be able to breed again as a female. The colors can vary a great deal, green and brown or mahogany. When I've led tours of Belle Isle, there's a fascinating range of color in these plants, all just within that one community. This plant, all these photographs were actually taken in my yard by my friend Don Schulte. He's just a fabulous photographer. It's been a real privilege to work with him. And I've actually gotten some additional ones from friends of mine to kind of color up my Jack in the Pulpit selection. There is a great deal of variety within the species. Claytonia virginica, spring beauty. This is a plant that I found in masses at Baldock Park, not so much at the Aspen Trail, but the Oak Savanna context outside the fenced-in Aspen Trail. Baldock is actually bisected by Chandler Park Drive, and on one side you have the sledding hill and the athletic fields. The other side is the picnic area, which is actually within an Oak Savanna. And then there's a like a little playground thing or a jungle gym thing. There's a zip line. And then there's the Aspen Trail that's fenced off separately, but is easily accessed through some openings in the fencing. We've found swaths of this at Baldock with a tremendous degree of variation in coloration. Some flowers being very, very pale, almost completely white, if not completely white, ranging to flowers with petals that are quite intensely pink. I remember reading an article about explaining, sort of trying to explain why there would be this diversity within the species. And the thought is that it may have to do with pollination, varying strategies in terms of getting pollination. The only other plant that I've come across, native plant that I've come across that has a high level of floral color diversity is Clematis occidentalis, which can range from white to pink to blue to purple, and interestingly can be either single or double, even in wild collected open pollinated seed. Very unusual to see that kind of dynamic within a single species. Sometimes this can be yellow, but it has grassy foliage. It's not very erect foliage. It's a bit prostrate, and it's almost a little succulent compared to grass. It can be very difficult to distinguish from grass until you start to realize that the foliage is a little more succulent than grass blades, and it's a little more, as prostrate, a little droopy compared to the grass, which tends to sit up. Really nice in context with like pen sedge. Dicentra cucularia, Dutchman's breeches. There's also a plant called squirrel corn. I think it's Dicentra canadensis, which is one of the two Dicentra species native to Michigan. There is a Dicentra eximia, which is called bleeding heart, but I don't believe that's native to Michigan. Correct me if I'm wrong. Called Dutchman's breeches because it looks like a pair of men's pantaloons hanging upside down on the clothesline. It has a wonderful ferny foliage, very delicate. I love this. A lot of these plants are really quite diminutive, so they're not huge. They're very charismatic, but in a restrained way. I've been trying to find squirrel corn, but I haven't had much luck. And the squirrel corn refers to the corms look like kernels of corn. I haven't been able to find that anywhere that I can rely on. Okay. Dodecathene media, or Eastern shooting star. I actually bought this plant many, many years ago. I found a pink one at some nursery somewhere, put it in the ground, had no idea what I had, and lost it. It persisted for a few years. It was beautiful, and then it went away. And I haven't been able to find a true pink one that's been able to persist. I find this rather interesting because typically I have observed that plants with white flowers, if you have a species that has a white form and then a non-white flower form, I usually have observed that the white flowering form seems to be less vigorous. That was not the case. I have found pink forms numerous times that I've tried and tried and tried, and they just don't make it. The white performs flawlessly in my garden. These beautiful multiple flowers, these I guess you might call them a raceme. I'm not certain if that's exactly the right term. These clusters of flowers, and you can see where the name comes from, the shooting star. Very delicate, sort of cabbagey leaves, sort of similar to Virginia bluebells, but more diminutive than Virginia bluebells, the foliage. But again, like Virginia bluebells, once the plant is done, it disappears completely. Erythronium albetum, I mentioned this plant when I was talking about Belle Isle, the white trout lily. This is the less common species, the more common being, I think we're going to see that next, Erythronium americanum. This is one of those plants. Mayapple is another one. If the plant has to have two, each plant has to have, if the plant is going to flower, it has to have two leaves. The reason for this is that if the plant is only able to send up one leaf it's not going to be enough to photosynthesize sufficiently to restore the corm from bearing fruit. Okay. There's only one organism I know of that makes babies when it can't afford it, and it's not in the plant kingdom. So when you go and if you see an area filled, and they can fill an area of trout lilies, you'll see not everyone is blooming, but the plants that have 2 leaves will be blooming. The challenge with this plant is it also has what we call retractile roots. And what that means is the roots of the plant will pull it further and further into the ground. Now, if you're going to try to grow it in your garden, the way to sort of deal with this is plant it above like a slab of slate or something so it can't go any further down. Out in nature, the way this is compensated for is it's a plant that grows often in vernal pooling contexts. So you're talking about a context that has a very high water table when the plant is awake, and it's not going to pull itself down below the water table. And that water table won't drop for quite some time, several weeks, usually in spring, although who knows anymore. And that's how the dynamic functions in its natural context. So it's called trout lily, also called fawn lily because of the modeling of the leaves. You can see here how the leaf is modeled. Sometimes called dogtooth violet because the corm looks kind of like a canine tooth. When it goes to seed, you have a kind of ovoid seed head, and the pistil is still pointing out. It's dried, but it looks like it's also sometimes called adder's tongue because of how the plant looks like as it's gone to seed. Like a lot of other white flowers, it can get a little bit of a tint as it ages. In this case, a little bit of a bluish tint as it starts to go by. But you can see, I love how the petals reflects. And if it's a sunny day, they reflects more than if it's a cloudy day. Here's an Erythronium americanum. And you can see better here the modeling of the leaves. And this plant has the same life ways as its cousin, the white trout lily. This was in my garden. I've had a hard time getting these to persist in my yard. I don't have exactly the right conditions. I think the absence of vernal pooling in my yard is possibly an issue. I wish I could find a seep in my yard somewhere because there are a lot of other plants I'd like to grow. And my yard is also too alkaline to do some things I'd like to do. So I love this contrast between the brilliant sulfurously yellow petals here and the sort of almost mahogany stem and these leaves. Really beautiful plant. Hepatica acuta. This is another plant whose name has been changed. It's no longer hepatica. It's now anemone. This is sharp-lobed hepatica. This naming, this old name, hepatica, goes back to what was called the doctrine of signatures. And this was a very old medical principle in which plants were associated with parts of the human body and were thought to be able to treat the parts of the human body with which they were identified. Hepaticas have 3-lobed leaves, like the human liver has 3 lobes. So that's where the association came from. You know, hepatitis is often associated as a disease of the liver. This all ties back together. Again, now an anemone, no longer hepatica. Found in rich woods and floodplains, often in limestone. So that's why it does pretty well in my yard, because I do have alkaline soil. It can have, you can have pale or dark violet flowers, or in this case, as you see, white. I have an acquaintance who refers to DYFs in terms of summer native plants, damn yellow flowers, because there's so many flowers that are blooming yellow during the summer. In the spring, it's more DWFs, damn white flowers. There's a lot of white flowers in the spring. And I had a gardening client who used to call me up every spring and complain about why do snowdrops have white petals? You know, it's not that you can't see them in the snow. And I had to explain to her, you know, Allison, first of all, it's not about us. And second of all, what you see is not necessarily what the insects see. So although this flower may be white to our eyes, it may actually have nectar guides that we can't see, because the visual field, if you were to talk about the visual field being the full range on a piano keyboard, the 88 keys, we see about an octave of that. Okay, so about a seventh of it. Okay. Insects see the full range from infrared to ultraviolet. And oftentimes the nectar guides on floral petals are in the range of light we can't see. So just because you can't see it or smell it or whatever, doesn't mean that the target organism can't see it or smell it. Hepatica americana, again, also now an anemone. This is round-lobed hepatica. These two distinctions are based on the shape of the leaves, obviously. Again, typically dark blue violet, but also possibly white. I like this image because it shows it's coming up right through the leaf mold that I leave. I leave all the leaves in my yard, much to my neighbor's chagrin at times. Again, another diminutive plant that is just, I have one of them growing in my tree lawn with my pen sedge and a few other things, and it's fascinating. I actually found a jack in the pulpit there a few years ago that I don't know where that came from. Jeffersonia diphylla, or twin leaf. You can see the source of the common name in the back. This is the leaf, the bifurcated leaf. This is a flower that if you don't really watch closely, you can miss it. The flower lasts less than a day, and then it develops this fabulous sort of urn-shaped seed head that, when it completely dries out, pops open and sprays the seed out. It's what we call a dehiscent seed. It's another example of this would be impatient species, which are actually named for this behavior. If you touch the pod, it'll actually burst open. And this is, again, another seed dispersal strategy that doesn't require anyone else's assistance. Blooming in early spring. This is a really cool plant, really great conversation piece. Mertensia virginica, or Virginia bluebells, probably our best known and spring wildflower, very popular wildflower. I love how the buds are pink, clearly pink, and then they open fabulously blue. I used to take Japanese woodblock printmaking classes, and I did a print of this. And look I love these cabbagey leaves. They're very friable. So when this plant actually goes dormant, there's nothing left of it. And if you were to dig it up, you'd find this massive, rather tangly, fibery roots, kind of like a Japanese anemone root system, and you wouldn't even know which way was up. Again, a plant that if you're going to be doing something around it, digging up, putting in, mark it with a couple of chopsticks so you know where it is, so you don't mess with it too much. I love this plant. Podophyllum peltatum, mayapple. There's a colony of this at Baldock Park that is dwindling away, unfortunately. I think that there's just too much competition for it. My sense of this plant is it likes a little bit more open. So when it says stream banks, it wants a little more open light than might be the case in the midst of a woodland. Not quite so much competition in terms of the root zone, maybe. Like the trout lily, you will not see a flower on a mayapple that only has one leaf. And it's interesting, the leaves are they're offset, and it's like a couple of umbrellas. And then the flower comes up beneath the stem from the second leaf, the lower leaf. And it's sort of demure, just sort of under there. And you could so easily miss it if you're not looking for it. Interestingly, the structure of this center looks very much like, this center area looks a lot like what we just saw with the Jeffersonia diphylla, the twin leaf. In really good conditions, this can persist quite a while into the season. Former client of mine had a whole bed of it in her yard, and it persisted well past spring, eventually going dormant. Sanguinaria canadensis, or bloodroot, another DWF. Part sun to shade, liking moist and well-drained soil. Pretty wide-ranging, typical white flower with yellow centers. The cool thing about this is it has one leaf that's a kind of palmate, I think would be the description, that unfurls. It's wound, or it's sort of furled around the stem. The flower comes up and will open sometimes before the leaf is even fully unfurled. And the leaf is as beautiful as the flower is and does persist quite a while. That's the strategy with these guys, is they're going to flower, but it's like a tulip. The tulips don't completely go dormant, don't start to go dormant right after they finish flowering. They actually photosynthesize, and oftentimes the leaves can expand even more because that plant is working to photosynthesize to rebuild that bulb, that food storage vessel. That bulb is a starch container, holds the calories so that the plant can perform the same task again the next year. So that photosynthesis cycle is very important. That's why they said, you can cut the flowers off your tulips, but don't cut them down until they start to go brown. That means they're done photosynthesizing for the season. Obviously, you don't cut down your wildflowers at all, ever. Okay. This is multiflora. This is the Sanguinary candensis multiflora, or double bloodroot, which I have found is not as stable or long-lived as its single cousin. It is a naturally occurring variation, but it is not as vigorous as the single flowering form. Trillium erectum, or wake robin. Trilliums are probably, as a group, the best known wildflowers. And there's quite a few species native to Michigan, 5 of which I've been able to grow and get to flower. I've got at least a couple others that I've worked with that I haven't been able to get to work. These all like light shade. They prefer moist acid soil, which is probably part of the problem I have, that I don't really have the perfect soil conditions. And that's why I have a lot of trillium that stick around, but they're not going gangbusters because I don't have quite the right soil. This is one of the larger. There are 2 classifications, and I have to remember, hang on a second. Always forget that. There are 2 broad classifications of trillium, and this belongs to one, the non-sessile form. Okay, pedunculate. Pedunculate, that's spelled P-E-D-U-N-C-U-L-A-T-E, pedunculate. And what this means is the flower is on a stem held above the 3 leaves, okay? So characteristics of this, flowers on a stem, and the foliage, as you can see, is basically solid green, one color. There's no mottling or anything. It's all one color. I actually had the same client that had the mayapple, had a mutation of this plant that was actually a 4-part, had 4 petals, 4 sepals, and 4 leaves in her yard. It was quite fascinating to see this. Another pedunculate trillium is the Trillium grandiflorum, or great white trillium. It's probably the best known trillium. Like a lot of white flowering hydrangeas, as the flower ages, it'll get kind of a pink cast to it. And actually you can see it's just starting to get a little bit rosy in here. So this flower is not a fresh one. It's been around for a little while. So these are the petals. This is the sepal. There are 3 sepals, and then you have the 3 leaves. Everything in parts of 3 on trillium. The other classification are the sessile species. That's spelled S-E-S-S-I-L-E. Excuse me. This is a yellow toad shade, and you see there is no stem. The flower sits directly on the tripartite leaf, okay? So there's no stem. And in the sessile group, they have mottled leaves. They are not solid green. There are these white markings. So that's the sessile versus the pedunculate. Trillium recurvatum, or prairie trillium. This is a really demure plant, not really brilliantly colored. The sort of, actually the most interesting part of the boss in the center here with the stamens and the pistil. And just the sepals and the petals both have this just blush on the green. And again, you see, this is a sessile form. The flower is held close, right directly on top of the leaves, and the foliage is mottled as well. And here is the name species for that characteristic, the sessile, trillium sessile, or toad trillium. The flowers are really cool. Just these tiny little petals held very close, almost closed, and just a more demure plant even than any of the others in terms of its scale. But again, you see the flowers held directly on above the leaves. There's no pedicel, and you see the mottled leaves. Spring ephemerals, sometimes you'll think they've gone away. If you've planted or transplanted wildflowers that seem to have disappeared, just be patient. Sometimes they go dormant for a season or so if they've been disturbed. So just give them time to settle in. Also, please be sure that you're purchasing your plants from a reputable grower or a reputable rescue. Wildflowers in our environment, these woodland wildflowers are some of the most poached species in our native flora. Many, if not most, are protected. So unless you're doing so on your property, don't touch them unless you have permission to do so by the property owner, and don't ever disturb them on public lands. There may also be circumstances where even if it is on your property, you may not legally be allowed to disturb them if they are protected in some way. So be sure that you are up on the law, and if you're going to be acquiring them, please go to a reputable grower. Don't be digging things out, and just please don't. So we're going to talk about some other spring woodland favorites, and these are not necessarily, these aren't ephemerals, but they're still really cool. And these are things that you might interplant with your ephemerals so that you kind of keep the season going and toward the transition into summer. So let's take a look at some of these. Actea pachypoda, there's also Actea rubra, the doll's eyes, these beautiful, it's just like, it reminds me of like dew almost, how these beautiful, delicate little flowers that will eventually turn into white berries with dark spots, hence doll's eyes. The Actea rubra has red berries. The flowers are held above the foliage. So this is a plant that can be really quite stunning as a sort of almost a specimen in a woodland context. Maybe plant 3 of them together. Really beautiful plant. Aquilegia canadensis, Eastern columbine. I love this photograph because of you can see it's so good, so sharp. You can see the spider webs, the tiny little spiders that are hanging out, trying to make a living right there. And you can see in the background another flower over here. I love the columbines. They have these wonderful tall, stems that come up, wonderful basal foliage. So they work really, really well in the foreground of the garden. You can put them at the front because they have this low basal foliage, and yeah, the stems come up, but they're so light that you can see through them. It's like a sheer curtain. Lovely plants that are very attractive for, hummingbirds. Their bloom time often coincides with the arrival of hummers. And I have hummingbirds that come to my yard every year. The one failing my yard has, huge failing, I have no evergreen cover to speak of, and I don't know where I would put it now. On the other hand, I have neighbors 2 doors down on either side of me that have wonderful arborvitae hedges that are quite healthy. So this is preferred habitat, nesting habitat for hummers. So there is nearby habitat, and I have everything else they need. So it's actually not such a bad deal. Columbines are pretty promiscuous. So if you have cultivars that they'll cross, they just get along with everybody else in the genus. Asarum canadense, wild ginger. This is photographed in my garden. We did also find this plant at Baldock Park. This is one of the plants that Bill Schneider said, this is not a plant that typically survives development, and indicates it's quite likely that that little area was never under the plow. And it was one of those serendipitous moments that I found this colony in the park. Another plant I'm hoping I'll be showing you is another one that I just happened to find. Beautiful heart-shaped leaves. I actually like the native ginger better than the European ginger, because the leaves aren't shiny. They're sort of satiny, almost. They're just fabulous. They're not matte, but there's this soft satiny quality to them. Heart-shaped foliage. Takes a little while to fill in, but boy, it makes a fabulous ground cover once it's settled in. And these lovely urn-shaped flowers held close to the ground, pollinated by crawling insects. So, when we talk about pollinators, I remember the Nature Conservancy, had their pollination thing, and they only talked about things like butterflies and bees. And it's like, there's so many other things that perform pollination services, just within the insect kingdom, let alone the birds and mammals and amphibians. So this is something that's pollinated by creeping, crawling things like beetles and ants. And it holds the flower close to the ground in order to get those services. Caulophyllum thalictroides. So here we go. Caulophyllum, the thalictrum-like calophyllum. Not sure that this has been changed. We'll have to look that up. Tiny little yellow flowers, just so delicate. And, just tiny, delicate things, wonderful things. Cypripedium parviflorum. This is a plant that I am so lucky to have. My friend Trish Hacker-Henning up in Ortonville, a young woman came to her door one day, and I think it was her mother had moved in to a property not far away and had put in turf, replacing wildflowers, including Michigan lily and yellow lady slipper. She had 2 pots of this that she gave Trish, and Trish was good enough. I had given some plants from my mother's garden to Trish. I shared them around after she died, and she gave me this pot of this orchid, but that actually is doing quite well in my yard. And I tell you, I babied it the first 5 years. I was really obsessive about getting this thing to survive. And these are amazing plants. This flower is actually not very big. It's smaller than my fist, but it's so charismatic. It looks larger than it actually is. It's one of the more tolerant, I don't want to say tolerant. It's one of the less specific native orchids in terms of its context. It does not have a symbiotic relationship with a specific plant or series of plants, unlike some of the other showy orchids. So it is a little easier to be able to grow in various contexts. I think the showy lady slipper may be one of the ones that has to have a certain association with a certain type of tree or context. I think I've tried to grow that without success. This one I'm grateful to have, and grateful that it continues to persist and do well. Every year it sends up maybe 1 more stem. So we're up to about a dozen stems on this now. I just love it. It's a highlight of my spring garden tour. Fragaria virginiana, wild strawberry, all those strawberries that you buy at the market, all of them go back to this plant. So when you see that scene in Emma where they're at the strawberry fields at whenever, I think it's the Abbey, those strawberries aren't native to Britain. They're the descendants of our native wild strawberry. And beautiful little white flowers, another DWF, and then delicious little fruit, tiny little fruit. And if you can get to it, boy, is it good. But you're going to have to beat the birds, and they're up pretty early in the morning. Makes a wonderful ground cover. Sending out daughter plants, runners, and it's one of the ground covers I've put in my front yard as I pulled out all the Pachysandra. I've got this and a few other things that I'm trying out to see how they do under my oak tree. Geranium maculatum, wild geranium or cranesbill. This is one of the easiest native plants to grow. This is one of the things I'll recommend to someone who's a little tentative and uncertain, this sort of thing, because it performs unfailingly. And the other thing that I discovered about this a few years ago, it has utterly fabulous fall color. foliage goes this fabulous maroon, reflecting the red of my oak tree and my serviceberry and everything. It's fab. So put a lot of this in. You won't be disappointed. GM triflorum, prairie smoke. So this is a plant that's, dry woods or prairies, kind of maybe the margins of things. Pretty different from a lot of our other GM species. It's called, you can see triflorum because it's always 3 flowers together. And then prairie smoke is because that's how it goes to seed. It's in the ranunculus family. So if you think about this seed head, it looks a lot like the seed head of a clematis, for example. The ranunculi all have similar seed head forms. You have this feathery tail. So we know that this seed, its dispersal strategy is wind. It's wind facilitated dispersal. The seed itself is down here and it has this little tail that's like a little wing. Hydrophyllum virginianum, or eastern waterleaf, or Virginia waterleaf. This is another plant that I discovered at Baldock just serendipitously. It's funny how I can be walking on the path going one direction and I don't see this. I have to come back walking the other direction and go, there it is. It's so funny. It was the first time I ever saw this plant, didn't know what it was. And then I saw it at Bill's nursery the next time I was there later that year. The flowers are white to kind of a pale to deep violet. So there's some variation, but it's all within this one range. And the leaves are mottled, somewhat like the Ceciliform trillium. There's these white kind of mottling on the leaf, which is where the name water leaf comes from, because the leaf looks kind of like it has water on it. Metella diphylla, bishop's cap. This looks wonderful with Virginia bluebells. And this is another plant that I struggled with for a long time, trying to find the right place. And I finally found the right place. And now I'm shoehorning as much of it as I can in there because I just love it. And it's doing so beautifully. I had it, I think, in too dry and a little too much shade. Yeah, I found the right place finally. Not, again, very diminutive, kind of demure, but it's called bishop's cap because this flower looks a lot like a bishop's mitre. Yeah, funny shaped cap. Think about a chess piece, the bishop. That's what the mitre is that thing on the hat. Pachyra aureus, formerly Senecio aureus, golden groundsel, also called golden ragwort. I try to go for the sexier names because I'm trying to sell this. Anything with wart, weed, rag, snake, spider. I said wart, didn't I? These, spleen, ebony spleenwort, gorgeous, gorgeous little fern, beautiful with this dark, almost black midrib. Try to sell someone on ebony spleenwort. Oh my gosh, no. We've got to find a better name for this. It's like another one that is American bladdernut. Oh yeah, that's something that everyone's going to go out and buy. They should. It's an absolutely gorgeous shrub, but with a name like bladdernut, it's a tough sell. We're going to call it now showy lantern bush. How about that? Showy lantern bush or American lantern bush. Golden groundsel, beautiful. Put it with your columbine. Gets these fuzzy seed heads when it's done. You're going to want to cut the stems down after it flowers once they start to get kind of ugly looking to keep it looking beautiful, but it has this lovely basal foliage. It runs around in my yard and I let it go. I've learned to be a little less controlling over time because I try to manage things. I'm like, why am I managing this stuff? Why am I not just letting it be happy? And it's really made my life a lot better in a lot of ways. Phlox divaricata, wild blue phlox. This is the woodland phlox, a more particular plant than the prairie phlox. I find that it's not as vigorous. I also find less seed set on this. Trish told me that was something I should expect, and she has been right about that compared to prairie phlox, which is a pink flowering phlox species. It is so pretty though. And we have so few blue flowers that I'm willing to invest a lot into finding the right place for this plant. It doesn't like to be real exposed. It wants to have some protection. I'm not certain if it's the cold or the wind or whatever it is, but I'm trying to create a context with some New Jersey tea and some other plantings, some tiarella, et cetera, creating a community that hopefully it can be happy in. I think a lot about plant communities, and maybe I'm making novel communities. They may not be natural communities, but I'm trying to create novel communities where everyone is happy working together. And I'm starting to have some success with this and carrying that information with me as I go forward. Polemonium reptans, spreading Jacob's ladder. This is another plant that seeds really well in my yard. And I dig it up between the bricks in my back walk and plant it around. I've started putting some in my front garden as well, as I'm filling more stuff in with ground covery type things. So this is a plant that you can use as a ground cover. It will persist long after it's flowered. And it does seed around pretty freely, and it's not real aggressive. It's not going to be something that's going to cause a problem. And it plays well with others. I mean, these are plants that have adapted to play well with others. They're not monocultural plants. And there's, the best mulch is lots of plants. So that's what I want. I want lots of plants. Pelicanatum biflorum, small Solomon seal. There's a triploid form of this that I've read about in Liam Kalina's book. That's 4 or 5 feet tall or something. I have been trying to find that. And I had a line on some, and then I lost touch with that person. I'm kicking myself still to this day. I would love to have a 5 or 6 foot tall Solomon seal in my yard. That would be fabulous. I mean, I would charge admission to my garden tour then if I had that to show off. Typically the plant is 1 to 3 feet tall. And if you look at how the flowers are arranged, you can see this is related to lily of the valley. But this is native. That's not native. Smilacina racemosa, false Solomon seal. Now I think it's myanthemum. Same genus as Canada Mayflower. The smilacinas are now myanthemums. And we have found some of, I think it's this one at Baldock. Every year I go there, I see new things. That's one of the best things about going there. There's a wonderful range of vines there. It's a great vine study. There's running strawberry bush, which is a native euonymus species. There is moonseed vine. There's Virginia creeper. There's wonderful poison ivy, beautiful poison ivy in there. And I'm certain there's probably wild grape in there. Wonderful, that's just the vines in this very small area. And we found this. And there is also a colony, not in the Aspen Trail section, but again, out in the oak savanna that we actually found Canadian Mayflower, Myanthemum canadense, which is a smaller, it's probably about that tall, the leaves. But if you start looking at it, you can see how, yes, these are the same genus and their behaviors and structures, et cetera, very similar. This is stellata, Myanthemum stellata. So uniformly Smilacina stellata, starry false Solomon seal. Styloform diphyllum or celandine poppy, sometimes called woodland poppy, but I think there are 2 different species. This is celandine. And as sulfurously yellow as these petals are, so is the sap of the plant. When we talk about bloodroot, the reason we call it bloodroot, excuse me a moment, is because the plant has red sap. In this case, the sap is sulfurously yellow. Like other poppies, it'll bloom in the spring, look lovely, and then kind of get a bit raggedy, and it might bloom again in the fall. Not always, not a guarantee, but it can be remontant in the right conditions. I had yellow, I had them blooming in my front yard last fall again, which is just, when it does happen, it's such a treat. And very typical poppy-like foliage, which is really cool stuff. I mentioned Tiarella cordifolia in context with my woodland phlox, running foam flower. The heucherellas are crosses between a heuchera and Tiarella cordifolia. You can see why it's called foam flower. The foliage is very similar to heuchera foliage. It's a bit smaller, excuse me, and the lobes are pointed, more pointed, sorry. And you have these efflorescences. If you think about the structure of these plants, the tiarella and a heuchera, they are very similar. And I need to go and look and see how closely they are related. I think they may be closely related, which would explain their propensity for crossing. Uvularia grandiflora, large flowered bellwort. I love this plant. Actually, William Kalina actually suggested it as a ground cover, and he sort of blows the lid off the idea that ground covers have to be, you know, this tall. This plant is probably about 12 inches tall, and it's not in the very best aspect in my yard, and probably I should transplant some of it to the front and see what happens. It's under my yew tree, but it still seems to do pretty darn well under there. This is probably a Hicksii yew. It's the only plant on the property that was here when I moved in 1995. Everything else is gone except for this yew tree. And what I've done is I pruned it up from a shrub form. There was a bowling ball under there I found when I pruned it up, among other things. I found my cat Alex under there the day I moved in. I pruned it up into a more of a tree form. And I can't tell you how, every year I get compliments on how beautiful this trunk looks on this tree. And it's nothing that I've done except make it so people can see it. The uvularia is under there along with the Jeffersonia diphylla. There's wild ginger. There's a large male fern. There's lady fern. There's a whole bunch of stuff under there along with this uvularia. I've looked for other uvularias. There's at least one or two other species native to Michigan, but I've not been able to find them. Violas, violets. A lot of people don't like violets. Violets are utterly fabulous. They're really, really amazing plants. They are a host plant for the great fritillary butterfly, which doesn't lay its eggs on the plant from what I understand, but adjacent to it. It has a very interesting reproductive strategy. It puts out these beautiful flowers. You can see the nectar guides. These are like the guys on the tarmac at the airport, you know, signaling the planes in. This is what's happening here. This is telling the insects, this is where you need to go. The good stuff is back here. It's right back here. You need a long enough tongue to get back here to the nectaries. This is a long spur violet or Viola rostrata. I have probably 8 or 10 native violet species in my yard, and I adore them. Sororia is the one everyone hates. That's the common blue violet. I also have Labradorica. I have birdfoot. I have, I think, is it arrow-leaved? I have prairie violet. I got those three, the birdfoot, prairie violet, and arrow-leaved I got from Chad Houston over in Kalamazoo at his nursery. And they're doing fabulous. I know at least one of those, I think the prairie violet is a protected species, and it's reproducing in my yard, which is a very gratifying turn of events. I'm not doing anything. People ask me, do you propagate? I'm like, no, my garden propagates. I don't have time to propagate. But I also have yellow forest violet, which we also find at Baldock. I have Canadian white violet, the Viola rostrata. So I think that's probably 7 or 8 species at least. And you know, they're beautiful and they don't require any care. You can move them around pretty easily if you want. I love them. They're beautiful. I'd like more of them. This is the yellow forest violet. So the nectaries are back up here. Canadian white violet. And if we're going to talk about shrubs a little bit, woody plants, pussy willow, often associated with Easter, one of our native shrubs. And of course, the males have the catkins. And serviceberry. We know when serviceberry blooms that summer is on its way, and we're going to have delicious edible fruit that we're going to be fighting the thrushes, thrashers, and robins to get at in just a little while. Okay, let's look at the questions. Are you doing a spring tour this year? Yes, I will be doing a spring tour on Okay, the spring tour is June 4th. From 10 to 2. And you don't have to like register or call ahead or anything, just come by. If we have enough interest, I will do a little tour through the property of how I have inadvertently created a bird haven with the plants I've put in. It's become more conscious in the last few years, but the first time I did this a few years ago, probably about 4 years ago, I thought, oh, I'll do a little tour of the garden, show people things that they can do for the birds. And it'll take half an hour maybe. And 2 hours in, I was not even halfway through the backyard. And realized that, oh, wow, I guess I'm doing quite a lot here. There's so many things you can do in terms of plant selection. And one of the things I did during the pandemic back in 2020 is I took out the last bit of lawn that I had in my yard. And I did a presentation 2 days ago about clematis for a group in Ann Arbor. And I had a really old picture of my backyard. And it was like, oh my God, that's what it used to look like. Wow. Yeah. Okay. Took out the last of the turf that I had on the property, and I put in what I call permaculture for wildlife. Last year was the first year my hazelnuts bore fruit. Did I get to have any? Absolutely not. It's not for me. It's for the squirrels. It's for whoever wants it. I do have some plants that are not native to this context. Thimbleberry is one of those. It's obviously native much further north than here, but I'm hoping it will bear fruit because I hear the flowers are beautiful, first of all, but if it has fruit, it's more food. We've been hearing about this issue with the birds, this terrible disease, and I don't remember if they've even given it a name. It was very prevalent east of us and moving west. I'm quite concerned about that. And one of the things they were telling us to do was don't put out bird feeders, because that creates a context for transmission by collecting all the birds close together. And this just, it's, hey, it's just basic science. It's what we've been dealing with for the last 2 years. If you get a bunch of people together and they're not taking the appropriate precautions in terms of vaccination or masking or whatever, you're going to have exchange of organisms, of molecules, or whatever you want to call it. And some of those are going to be disease bearing. So if you can minimize that risk by taking the appropriate steps, that's a good idea. And so we're talking about by not putting out bird feeders, which of course, if they're not well maintained, can contribute in other ways to illness in bird populations. So my strategy for a long time has been, I plant bird food. And I've got black currant, I've got serviceberry. I actually found American crabapple out at Chad Houston's nursery. I got 2 of those a couple of years ago. One's in the front, one's in the back. Couldn't believe I found them. Yeah, that was a great moment. But I've put in, and I've got showy lantern bushes, I now call it. The spireas, I've got both spireas. I've got just a lot. And I've got, the other thing I put in was prickly ash, which I don't know if the fruit ever gets used. It's one of the 2 northernmost orange species that are native here. But I know it's a host plant for the giant swallowtail butterfly, which means food for butterfly caterpillars, which means food for baby birds. Okay. And that's when I realized, when I started going through my yard with this group, how much, because I'm not just talking about feeding the adult birds, I'm talking about feeding the baby birds. And I have a lot of host plants that provide forage for the adults to secure for their babies. So yes, my tour, the tour will be June 4th. The summer tour, I think, is Saturday, August 20th. And if you want more information, but don't want to sign up for the newsletter, no harm, no foul, just send me an email,cenglish@blackcatpottery.com. I think Carolyn put my email address in the chat. Okay, and wild type nursery in Mason. Yes, there was one answered question. All right, got it. Okay. So I think both of those questions are answered. Let's look at the chat. Okay, Cami. Pine trees. Okay. The best thing under pine trees in my experience is pine straw. Because we're talking about pine trees are very dense and they don't defoliate to the same extent that deciduous trees do. All trees lose their leaves. When we talk about an evergreen, like a pine tree or a juniper or an arborvitae or a spruce or what have you, any of those, they do defoliate. They lose about 1/3 of their needles every year, but they hold on to the other 2/3. So we don't really see it as defoliation. You might be able to grow some things under pine trees, but it's going to be more of a challenge because these are plants that are adapted to have at least a window of light early in the season with the deciduous woodland. You're going to want to look for things that are acid soil context. So that's one of the things you're going to want to look for. And you're going to want to look for things that are content with very low light. So those are the criteria that you need to meet. And I don't know enough about that context to be able to tell you, but look for those characteristics. Not all spring ephemerals have an eliosome. Okay, Betty. Reed's paradox, comment. I'm not certain that I have a response to what Haskell has to say. I would think that it's not just ants that are engaging in this dynamic with the eliosome, and it's not limited to that that specific family of insects and their behaviors. Not being an entomologist and not being a geologist probably would be another thing that would be helpful. I'm not really certain. I haven't read what Haskell has to say. So I should probably look up what Haskell has to say and then think about it. And I might then have a comment to make. Ruinemone. Okay. So when I'm looking for native plants, whether it's ruinemone or anything, there are a couple of tracks that I go on. One is finding the local growers who are using open pollinated local genotype seed. Okay. The other thing to look at is plant rescue. So Cranbrook has their plant sale every year, and maybe I'm a horrible person. Well, never mind. Let's not get into that. I joined the Cranbrook. I became a member at Cranbrook just so I could get into the plant sale, the native plant sale, the day early. That was the only reason. I paid my money and I found some great stuff. But I'm going to tell you, even though I got in there as quickly as I could, there were things that were sold out by the time I got there. It's very competitive. I don't even know if there's anything left for the people who aren't members. So that is something to look for. They did have some ruinemone last year. The thing is, every year it's different what they have to offer because it's based on what they've been doing. Can't seem to grow mertensia. Well, I guess this is my thought about if you can't grow something else. I would think that perhaps for some reason the context is not right. And instead of struggling with that, I would find what is right. It's like, I think that sometimes I'd like to change the paradigm. I'd like to change the conversation from one where we are talking about, this is what I want to grow, and what do I need to do to make it grow, to saying, this is what you can grow here. And I've worked with easily over 200 plants on my property and had fair success with the majority of them. And I know that there's at least 10% of those that could work for any property in this area, just statistically speaking. The thing that I've tried to get used to is if something doesn't work, it doesn't work. I might try it in another place, or maybe it just doesn't work here. I have a certain environment in terms of the soil texture, the soil chemistry, the pH, all this stuff, the sunlight, the availability of water. These are all the characteristics of the environment on my property, which is not very large. There are some areas that have a microclimate, or I might have a little more access to water because I'm doing some, hydrology in terms of what's happening with my downspouts, et cetera. But if I can't grow everything. I can't grow skunk cabbage. I wish I could grow skunk cabbage. I'd give another tooth if I could grow skunk cabbage. I'm never going to grow skunk cabbage. I'm never going to grow marsh marigold. I don't have the appropriate context for it. If something is not working, maybe it's just not working. And instead of struggling with it, maybe I need to try something else. That's what I'm trying to become a little more zen about it. Okay, Barb Anderson. Oh, Barb Anderson, what you're talking about is what is called barren strawberry. And that is a plant that has changed its name a number of times. Let me see if I can find it. It used to be, I think, a GM or something, or Fragaroides is the Fragaroides is the epithet. I think it's a barren strawberry. Let's see if it is 2225. I have that plant in my yard, and I would caution you that it can be very aggressive. It can be, it may not be in your yard. It was very aggressive in my yard, and I have been trying to get rid of it because it just takes over. It's Waldsteinia fragaroides. That's Waldsteina. Waldsteinia fragaroides, Fragarides. So it's the strawberry-like Waldsteinia. It has yellow flowers and has a small, hard, I don't want to say inedible, but unpalatable fruit. And as I said, it looks a lot like strawberry in the foliage and its habit. It puts out daughter plants exactly the same way. Will wildflower strawberry hybridize with my cultivated strawberries? I'm not sure, Michelle, if that would be a concern. Sort of playing devil's advocate here, it may provide some additional genetics for your strawberry that might give it a completely, might bolster it in some way, as we've seen with going back to wild apple stocks and trying to reinvigorate some of our cultivated apples. So I don't know that it would hybridize. And if so, it's not going to hybridize where your strawberries are. It will hybridize somewhere else in the yard. It's not going to affect your strawberries that you've planted. It would create a colony elsewhere where those seeds are stocked. And if you eat all of them, it won't matter. The wild strawberry, the fruit is red. I don't think that Barb Anderson is talking about wild strawberry. Bird. Oh, thank you, Barb. Planting bird food. Okay. Yes, barren strawberry is native. It's very successful. That's a nice way to put it. Any other questions or ideas or comments?
Those are the ones that I all copied and pasted into a document so I could ask, but you found them all.
Okay. All right. Well, it's been really lovely spending the evening with you. I have 6 hungry cats who have been really actually very well behaved. I'm hoping that the next time we meet, it's been a few years, I hope that I get to see you again some other time in person. That would be ever so lovely. And I'm going to do one more thing. I'm a potter, and this is my new miniature decorative hex birdhouse that just came out of the kill the other day.
Oh,
So I make
nice.
functional birdhouses. This is what I have a customer, a wholesale customer down in Florida who saw my lanterns and asked if they were birdhouses. And I said, no, they're not. And I thought, well, I could make some little decorative birdhouses. So this is not something that's going to be used by anyone. The opening's too small, even for a house wren. But imagine a bunch of these in different colors and different textures and glazes and hanging in your tree or something, maybe. I might have some of these at the garden tour in June if I have a minute to make more. And I'm going to have a square shaped one too. I hope. I'm working on it. But a preview of what's in the works in the pottery studio. So thank you so much. Please take care, stay safe and well, and maybe I'll get to see some of you in June or August. Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Everybody have a wonderful evening and think spring.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.